and I'll now like to introduce Nicky Ison. So Nicky is the Energy Transition Manager of WWF Australia, where she's leading their new campaign to accelerate Australia to become a renewable export powerhouse. Prior to joining WWF, Nicky co-founded the Community Power Agency, was a senior research consultant at the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology Sydney, UTS, and a strategist at the Climate Action Network Australia. She was the lead author of the Repower Australia Plan, a policy blueprint to get to 100% renewables. She's an acknowledged leader, expert, and commentator in the fields of energy policy, community energy, and the transition to clean energy. In 2014, Nicky was recognised as Westpac and the Australian Financial Review's 100 Women of Influence list. It's a pleasure to have you join us, Nicky. I really look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. I appreciate it. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Great. And can people see the slides that I'm sharing? Great. Hi, everyone. Lovely to be with you. What an excellent lineup of speakers. Very pleased to be participating in this. Before I go further, I would like to acknowledge that we are, if you're in Australia, on Aboriginal land. And I here live on Gadigal land and would like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. So I'm going to talk a little bit today around the role that WWF Australia sees renewable hydrogen playing in a low emissions world. As we know, climate change is a global crisis that is affecting millions, if not billions of people. The Black Summer of fires that we experienced were unprecedented and likely to escalate unless we take urgent action. So for those, before I get into the nuts and bolts of where we're headed with hydrogen, I thought I'd give a bit of background to WWF Australia. So WWF Australia is one of 100 national offices of WWF globally. We are the world's largest environment organisation. And globally and in Australia, we're often known for our work around environment and the protection of different species. You might have seen earlier this year, Marianne, who was one of the koalas saved through bushfires with the aid of funds from WWF. But what you may not know is that WWF has, both globally and in Australia, for decades worked on the clean energy transition and the technological and market solutions for this transition. Currently, we have 3 main programs in Australia that are really helping to drive this. So the first is the Business Renewable Centre, which helps broker between renewable developers and large energy users who are looking to purchase renewables. And as a result of that, we've seen a massive uptake in corporate renewable PPAs. We have the Global Science-Based Targets Initiative that works with companies to help them set climate science-based targets, and we have developed, in partnership with a number of other organisations, a series of decarbonisation methodologies for different sectors. The finance sector, the shipping sector is forthcoming, steel, power sector, transport, etc. And then finally, the new Renewable Powerhouse campaign. And this campaign aims to accelerate Australia to be the world's leading renewable exporter by 2030, and that is my role running that campaign. And it's based on the idea that many people have said already today that Australia does have a renewable energy advantage. Our abundant land, significant renewable resources, particularly wind and solar resources, strong trading relationships mean that we're well positioned if we act to prosper in a low carbon or zero carbon future. And that's why we're running a campaign to take Australia to 700% renewables. And that was an idea first put out there by Darren Miller, CEO of Arena last year. But we've done some more work to say, well, what does 700% mean? And that really means 3 things. First, 100% is decarbonising our existing electricity use. 300% takes us to the decarbonisation of our broader energy use, transport, industry, heating. And that leaves about 400% or 400 gigawatts of renewables that can then be used for renewable export purposes. And so we've done some work looking at what those renewable export opportunities are for Australia, and I have identified sort of 6 main types of renewable export opportunities, of which renewable hydrogen and its derivatives like ammonia are a really significant one. But the others, just so you know, are electricity transfer, such as the Sun Cable project proposed in Northern Territory. Solar powered products, and here is a really big role for use of Australia's renewable hydrogen, so green steel, green aluminium, advanced manufacturing, etc. Then those are the types of renewable exports that might use renewable electrons themselves. And then there's the ecosystem that sits around that. And I really think it's important for us to think about that ecosystem as we grow a renewable hydrogen industry in Australia. So those three types of renewable exports are our expertise, components and the recycling of components. And so is there a role that we can play in the manufacture of components essential for the renewable hydrogen economy? And then software and services. And so that's sort of the software and technology needed to integrate all of these different renewable technologies, including hydrogen. So our position is that hydrogen is absolutely critical to addressing climate change. If you look, if you put aside land and agricultural sector emissions and looks purely at fugitive emissions and primary energy emissions, there are four main sets of technologies we see as absolutely essential to decarbonisation. First is energy and resource efficiency, so we should be doing more with less. The second is obviously firmed renewables, particularly solar and wind, but also other types of dispatchable renewables, with storage, geographical distribution and flexible demand. And I think it's really important that when we think about firming, we don't just think about batteries and pumped hydro, though they will play a critical role, but we think about the geographical distribution that one of the earlier presenters talked to, and the opportunity that Australia has for that, given our huge continent. And the role of flexible demand. And increasingly, we see huge opportunities for flexible demand in the industrial sector. There's some really interesting technology in the aluminium industry, for example, flexible pot lines that could see 10%, aluminium accounts for about 10% of Australia's electricity demand. With the ability for that technology to ramp up that 10% generation by 20 or 5%, is quite a significant contribution to managing Australia's energy system, or it could be. The third area, and one that obviously is potentially in competition with, or there's a conversation to be had around the nexus between, is the electrification of transport, heating, and certainly my analysis and the analysis of many people is that electrification needs to come first, and wherever we can electrify transport, heating opportunities, particularly in households and industry, particularly for low temperature heat, we should be doing so, and that is the more efficient way of doing things. And yes, it will lead to a larger electricity system, but the fixed cost of that electricity system can be smeared across those different. And then that leaves renewable hydrogen for those countries and industries that are hard to electrify, and I'm going to come back to that. The next thing I think it's important to say is hydrogen is not a new industry, and it is a polluting industry. So globally, hydrogen production, which is 99% from coal and gas at the moment, accounts for about 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions. This is a chart from Wood Mackenzie from last year, and kind of gives you an indication that actually global hydrogen production is an area where we need to be looking at ways to decarbonise. And the great situation is that we have the technology that exists to do that through renewable hydrogen, electrolysis, using electricity. And really what we need to be doing is accelerating that, and Australia, with our abundant land and renewable resources, is very well placed to play a critical role in accelerating the decarbonisation of this existing industry. So we've in the process of, and soon we'll be launching our hydrogen position paper that will set up very clearly where we stand and where we think priority policy intervention is needed around the growth of renewable hydrogen and bringing it down the cost curve. We've been looking at what are both some of those short-term and longer-term market opportunities, and two of the questions that we've been asking in trying to assess whether an application of hydrogen or an end-use case might be worth investing advocacy time around or market development time around is, firstly, is the renewable hydrogen technology available for this use case soon, or is it likely to be available in the longer term? So, for example, the technology exists for renewable hydrogen to be integrated into ammonia manufacture, but the technology does not yet exist for hydrogen to fully decarbonise steel. There are trials going on around that at the moment, so it is likely to be available in the long term, but it isn't there yet. And then the second question is an alternative zero carbon pathway likely to be more cost effective, more functional, and have less negative externalities? So I'd point you to the graph on the right hand side. This is a comparison between electric vehicles and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles in the light vehicle sector, and you can see that battery technology, electric vehicle technology, is much more technically efficient, and that's not likely to be much more cost efficient, particularly in places like Australia. So really we need to be looking at those technologies and use cases where we can't, don't have easy electrification options. So we've identified 3 big long-term opportunities for Australia around renewable hydrogen. The first is in green building materials, steel, aluminium, and cement. As the world's leading exporter of iron ore, the world's leading or second largest exporter of alumina, and as a big user of cement. These are industries that are critical to decarbonisation. Steel, for example, accounts for 7% of global emissions, and as the Grattan Institute just found recently, there is opportunities through a renewable hydrogen pathway to create 25,000 jobs in central Queensland, in the Hunter Valley, through the creation of a green steel industry. We're fully supportive of that and see it as essential. We are currently working with the New South Wales government to look at and see whether we can develop a similar setup to the Business Renewable Centre, but for green building materials. So can we create markets and short-term demand for green decarbonised versions of these different materials that will then help stimulate and encourage the research and development that is needed and the early commercialisation that is needed to demonstrate these technologies and then start to bring it down the cost curve. The second opportunity that we see, particularly for Australia, is in zero carbon emissions fuel for shipping. There's a lot of work going on in the global shipping industry. Heard a little bit of talk about that today around what are the zero carbon fuel options. Biofuels is one, but that obviously comes with a number of negative environmental externalities. The second is ammonia, and there's a recent article that talks about how the global shipping, the majority of global shipping owners see a renewable ammonia and hydrogen potentially as well as the most likely and most viable long-term decarbonisation pathway for the shipping industry. Now, given our proximity to Singapore, which houses a huge percentage of the world's shipping fuels or bunkering fuels, there's a huge opportunity for Australia to become a massive supplier of renewable ammonia to Singapore and thus the global shipping industry. And then finally, of course, the opportunity that many people talk about, which is the export of hydrogen itself. We do think that this is a long-term opportunity. Obviously, places like Japan and South Korea and Singapore itself are looking at that option. But we think that really needs to target the countries that will find it difficult to meet their own energy needs through domestic renewables. And there's an interesting map that I've forgotten to include here, in the Bloomberg New Energy Finance Hydrogen Outlook paper that came out a couple of months ago that maps those locations around the world that will have that likely resource shortage. China is the biggest one, but then Japan, South Korea and certain places in Europe are also likely to be renewable resource poor. So that's good. Those are areas where we know renewable hydrogen will be absolutely essential to decarbonisation. But then, we know that renewable hydrogen is still expensive to produce. And one of the key ways to decreasing the cost and bringing renewable hydrogen down the cost curve is through driving early demand. So what are the early markets? And I'm repeating what many other people have already said today, but I thought I would reiterate. I think that we see that there are three critical short-term applications or big opportunities in the short term. The first, as I mentioned, is decarbonising the existing uses of hydrogen, such as fertiliser and explosives. And it's really heartening to see companies like Yarra Fertiliser, Renewable, Incitec Pivot, and even BP to really actively and proactively pursue renewable hydrogen through co-funded feasibility studies for their applications. And we hope that those feasibility studies will soon turn into operational. The second is in heavy transport, and I'm really looking forward to one of the presentations that comes after mine. When we've been talking to a number of investors in this area, they've consistently identified mining trucks and the use of renewable hydrogen for mining applications, including microgrids, which we've just heard about, as a significant opportunity due to the high cost of diesel and the abundance of renewable resources. The final is gas injection or injection of hydrogen into the gas grid. However, we have a significant concern that if hydrogen injection to the gas grid is prioritised, that it will delay electrification and thus extend the life of the fossil gas industry. So what we will be saying is that we are supportive of this up to 10%, where it doesn't require additional infrastructure upgrades, where this is also coupled with electrification programs, which unfortunately Australia is so sadly lacking behind many parts of the world. So to summarise, our position on hydrogen is that it is critical, but it should be renewable only, it should be traceable, it should be stringent public worker and environmental safety practices. It should be developed in accordance with sustainability principles. Any renewable technology does have an environmental impact, and we need to be looking at ways to minimise them. It should be pursued, as I've just discussed, as a complementary strategy to electrification rather than as a replacement to that. And finally, we should look at ways that this industry can be structured so that it helps lower energy costs for all Australian consumers. We don't want to go the way of the LNG industry, which has led to higher gas prices and higher electricity prices. We want to make sure that it's renewable hydrogen production is incentivised to operate at times of high renewable generation and disincentivised to operate at times of peak demand. Not dissimilar to the aluminium smelting industry at the moment. I want to come back to one aspect of the sustainability principles. There's been a lot of questions and discussion today around where the water for renewable hydrogen will come from. We think that there's a significant opportunity to really stimulate a more circular economy mindset in the creation of this new renewable hydrogen industry through looking at the opportunities around recycled water. We have not got a large recycled water industry in Australia, mainly due to the ick factor. However, if recycled water is used as an industrial feedstock, the same ick factor does not exist. So there's a real complementary opportunity for more sustainable water practices in Australia and synergies between these two industries that we really hope will be adopted and incentivised. So what's next? We are a week and a half ago for a renewable recovery to the current economic crisis that we are facing in this country and around the world. Based on this, we've worked with consultancy EY to identify the opportunities in a renewable recovery, and both based on those high-level opportunities, we've picked 5 that we think can help stimulate the economy right now, help put people to work, as well as position ourselves to be that renewable export superpower of the future, or at least put us on the pathway to doing that. And that's why one of our 5 stimulus measures is around accelerating the deployment of renewable hydrogen. So what we've done is created a pretty straightforward renewable hydrogen stimulus proposal that we're talking to the federal and state government around. This is primarily based around support for ARENA. Apologies, Paul. I think Nia is doing a great job but we're progressed on Arena at the moment, not least because it is running out of money and we're concerned about its future. And they are obviously running an excellent hydrogen electrolyzer round that we're fully supportive of. But we propose that there are 2 additional programs that Arena should be doing. One is a $25 million renewable hydrogen trucking or heavy vehicle grant round. And the second is the idea of establishing a renewable hydrogen industry hubs program. This is an idea that is part of the National Hydrogen Strategy, but we haven't seen any policy development towards that yet. Our suggestion is that those companies that are currently undertaking renewable hydrogen feasibility studies where they're found to be feasible or there's a pathway to feasibility, that they should be supported to scale or turn the feasibility into a real plant that could then become an anchor customer for a hydrogen industry hub. And there are some key strategic locations where you might want to focus those hubs, and I've suggested. So that's our work around renewable hydrogen at the moment. We've we've developed a position paper and we're starting to turn that into direct policy advocacy and campaigning. And would really welcome talking to anyone on this call who would be keen to support the advocacy that we're doing in this space because to finish where I started, we are in a climate crisis. We need to urgently be decarbonising. Renewable hydrogen will play a critical role in doing that, but we need to make it happen at scale as quickly as possible.
Fantastic. That's really great, Nicky. Loved very comprehensive, holistic plan there around renewable energy. Love the renewable energy superpower approach that Darren Miller espoused with his 700%. People might not be aware now, but we're currently a 350% energy economy, Australia. We export more than 2/3, but of our total energy production in gigajoules, only about 2% is in renewable. And as Geoscience Australia has shown, we've got huge potential to produce green hydrogen, and as you've heard today, and don't doubt that Australia can do that to become world leaders in an energy source. The last one we did was LNG. We spent $400 billion on LNG over a decade, and last year we exported more LNG than any other country. So really look forward to the days where we're exporting renewables and not only helping ourselves decarbonise, but helping the world decarbonise. There's just trying to think if there's questions coming in. Sometimes I'm not quite sure if who they're for, but there's a question here around electrolyzers. Not quite sure if it's a question for you, Nicky, at all. No.
Look, I will say one thing about electrolyzers, which I thought was interesting. The Bloomberg New Energy Finance hydrogen report found that the cost of electrolyzers in China is significantly lower than the cost of electrolyzers in the rest of the world, in significant part due to the structure of the financing and the company's business models, and likely that is connected to the support from the Chinese state. But I think that is an area worthy of investigation about going, are the cost of electrolyzers really about the cost of the kit, or is it the fact that we don't yet have sufficient demand and so there's a huge amount of overhead that is incorporated into the cost?
And very supportive of the regional hubs program that you talk about. The addition to that would be adding clusters and hubs together, so that it's not just production in those regions, but we're actually building a local knowledge economy, services, SMEs, scale-ups.
And that is part of our proposal, is that there should be that 200 million should go towards local training, develop and industry development, so that the people in those locations, those hub locations, are well equipped to be able to take jobs and get business through these new hydrogen hubs.
Fantastic. Look, really appreciate that, Nicky. We're right on time, I think, and I'm actually handing over to another chair. So that concludes our renewable hydrogen session. Really great, 3 stimulating presentations. Thank you very much. Nicky, just keep an eye on the Q&A. I think there may be some questions coming in for you now. We'd love you to engage with the audience on that. So it's now my pleasure to to hand over the chairing role for the next session, which is hydrogen mobility.